Hey everybody, my name is Antonio Diaz from Life and Time, the founder and editor-in-chief. Thank you so much for tuning in today, wherever you are in the world. We hope you're safe and healthy. We have so much to dive into today. This is our fifth or Steph, is it for fifth or sixth webinar? Might be our
Good
fifth one.
question. I want to say sixth now. I've lost
Yeah.
track of it.
We've been having so much fun doing these webinars and just providing as like a public education for our community here. And there's many more that we're going to be conducting throughout the next few months here and throughout the next few weeks. But we're just going to get into it. There's so much to talk about. Stef Ferrari is our senior editor here at Life and Time, who's tuning in from where are you, Steph? Connecticut?
I'm in Connecticut. I am in idyllic Shelton, Connecticut.
There you
Fairfield,
go.
about an hour plus from the city.
Okay, CT represent. All right, so Steph, I'm going to hand it off to you. Why don't you introduce our panelists and let's get into it.
Yeah, so I just want to say thanks to everyone for joining us today. We're really excited to have this conversation. This is something that we have wanted to dive into for a while now, and just to kind of set up the discussion that we're planning to have today and why we're having it now. Um, June, being Pride Month, we had wanted to host a webinar, something celebratory to kind of talk about queerness in the industry and celebrate that community. Um, but of course, there's quite a lot going on in the world right now. So we started to think about what that would look like, what would be the most useful, most meaningful conversation to be having right now for that community. Um, and Antonio and I were discussing it, and I sort of personally had this revelation as a member of the LGBTQ community where I was kind of like, I'm not entirely sure what those most important topics are right now. So maybe what the most effective thing to do right now would be to try to draw upon some expertise from within the industry. And we reached out to some folks that we thought were especially uh, profound in their expertise and coming from places of real leadership. And so that is the group that we are here with today. And we're hoping to just have sort of a casual peer-to-peer conversation about what it means to be queer in the food and beverage industry right now, what the needs of this community are, and provide some context, and hopefully identify some things that can be meaningful going forward. So we feel really, really fortunate to have this group with us right now. And I'm going to let them each just briefly introduce who they are, and where they're coming from right now in the world. So, V, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, thanks, Steph. And Steph, of course, coming live to you from our hometown. We are the most successful people to ever come out of Shelton, if I do say so myself, and certainly the queerest. Well, maybe not. But I'm V Spehar. I am like many of you folks, I'm currently on furlough from the James Beard Foundation. I was the head of the women's leadership and LGBTQ programs there, and just experiencing a lot of the same things that everyone on this webinar right now is. A little uncertainty about the future. Where do I want to go next? Trying to get TikTok famous. So that's what I've been up to.
Amazing. I highly encourage following V. Uh, Emily, do you want to tell us where you're coming from? And
unmute that because I am coming from Brooklyn and my windows are open. So yeah, that's where I'm at right now. I have been roasting coffee and preparing coffee and trying to just fill in at whatever places within the business have been needed during COVID, and sort of just working through that since March and kind of trying to see where we're going to be at in the future, taking it day by day. And yeah.
amazing. And Chef Silvana.
Silvana, Salcido, Esparza, Barrio Cafe, Phoenix, Mexican chef. trying to figure out what the fuck is going on. That's it.
Uh, and hopefully this conversation will help us, because I think we all are in that boat for sure. Kristen, do you want to tell us where you are and a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, Kristen Kish. I'm currently in New York and have been since the start of all this. My restaurant's Arlo in Austin, Texas, which is currently closed. And again, just saying everything that everyone else saying is just trying to figure out where we're supposed to go personally and how we're supposed to go as a group and as a team, and where our industry and just humankind is supposed to lead us, and trying to figure it all out.
And actually, Kristen, I think I'll start with a question for you here. And this is something that I think, kind of going into the conversation about what it means to be queer right now in the industry, or in the world. You and I, we had a little conversation recently about language, and the language of this community. I think one thing that I continually get asked is why the ever lengthening acronym. It was LGBT, then it was LGBTQ, and now there's a IA and plus. And I'm interested in sort of discussing that, how that, what that means, what the word queer has come to mean in this industry, and how that has been an evolution perhaps in your own life.
Yeah, I have always known I've been gay since I realized what it meant to have a crush on somebody. And but I didn't come out until I was 24. I'm 36 now, so relatively, I guess, late in the game. And for me, growing up, queer was always this word that was, you don't use it. It is a derogatory term, and it's something that I never was brought up saying, even when it was okay to say. And so, to be quite frank with everyone, it's still a word I don't feel it doesn't feel natural coming off my tongue. It's other people label me as queer and say I'm part of the queer community. I'm not offended by it, but I personally do not use the term, just because, again, it feels disingenuous to me. I also have been kind of confused in learning what it means, and then now if queer exists, this is a legit question. All the other fall under that same umbrella, if I'm correct. I've also never been a fan of the word lesbian. I prefer gay. I'm like, why do men and women have to have different? It's all a little confusing to me. I'm trying to figure it out and trying to learn and hear all the different perspectives, but I'm a student in it, just like many of us. But I'm a gay woman, and that's kind of how I've always kind of labeled myself.
And I think that's especially interesting. It was especially interesting for me to have that conversation with you, because I feel like I've had a similar experience. And I am starting to feel a little ill-equipped to answer those questions when they come my way. V, I wonder if, given your work as an activist in this space, and certainly you've done so much educating on how to use language or and labels and that sort of thing. Can you maybe give us a little bit of your take on that?
And I agree with Kristen. The different gendered words for even being gay were always very hard for me, because I identified as a gay person and I now identify as a non-binary person. But it was really this next generation that gave us that language. I knew that I was gay. I knew that I liked women. I was told that meant you were a lesbian, but I also kind of felt like I didn't like that. So one thing I think is so interesting is the fact that the younger generations are so willing to be micro-labeled, and they're also willing to have no label. There is no finite amount of gay. There is no finite amount of definition. So you can take what you want from that. You can be a pansexual, non-binary, whatever. The thing that I continue to run into with being an educator is often from the cis-het community, where they want to get it right. And I think a lot of people come from a place of wanting to get it right, but it's something that they just can't conceive of a lot of times. And so that causes a lot of, but what's the right answer? If 2 + 2 is 4, then where is the line between a man in a dress and a transgendered person? And I'm like, maybe there's not one. Maybe there's not one. You know, maybe it's all of that. And so I think that's a lot of the emotional labor that gets put on the gay community, is to provide answers to people who have sometimes a perverted sense of curiosity that is being masked as educate me.
Yeah, I definitely think there's in the role of language, you know, in general in the food industry, I think is a really powerful one, and especially when you get into kitchens that have traditionally been male dominated or male driven, or the patriarchy, you know, and how do all these new definitions play into it? You know, Silvana, your family has such a legacy of in the food industry. I think your biography tells me 800 years of baking tradition. So I'm curious, you've been in the food industry for quite some time. How have you seen language evolve within the food industry with respect to LGBTQ? And how has that language either been helpful or divisive, conversely?
The language has never changed. You know, like racism has never changed. It just got quiet. That's all. It's still there. All right. Listen, let's go back to queer real quick. You don't have to be in bed with the same sex to be queer. You know, queer originally was something odd, like, oh, isn't it queer how that person moves that way? Right? So it equates with odd. So as older generation, we didn't want to be queer. That was a heteronormative word put upon us. But the truth is, we all are queer because we're outside of the heteronormative. Within heteronormative, there's queer folk. And all these labels, I struggle with that as well, because I have what's called a cultural identity crisis as a Mexican-born American, right? Or the other way around, that's dyslexia, folks. All right? So I'm a Mexican-born in the United States, but I identify 100% Mexicana, you know? Therefore, here, Mexicana. Why did I choose that word? It's a reminder of where my soul is, where my spirit is. When people ask me, what are you? I'm saying, Mexicana. A Mexicana likes to kiss other girls. That's it. Why do I have to identify with a label? You know, because there's so many labels and it changes after decades. It will change. And I promise you, what is in now, what you think you like to be called, you're not going to want like that in 10 years, or the younger generation is not going to want to be called that. So we can stop labeling people and just call them humans. And that's my opinion. And that applies in the kitchen as well. And that racism and sexism that happens, homophobia that happens, it's always going to happen. The minute we take ourselves serious, the minute they're going to take us serious. Why does my gender or my sexuality have anything to do with my ability?
Yeah, and I think, you know, that's obviously a conversation that we've had a lot, even within the sort of women's space or the female space in the food industry in the last few years. Is it, are you a chef? Are you a female chef? Are you a chef? Are you a queer chef? You know, and how does that look? And what does it mean? And what are those additional layers? And it starts to, you know, become very much, I think, a question of representation, and making sure, you know, there's visibility. And that's clearly something that is very much top of the global mind right now, and the global news cycle. I think part of the reason that we did not have this webinar in June is obviously because there were extremely pressing topics. Pride in general was not what it is usually this year for a number of reasons, none the least of which we cannot congregate the way that we once would for Pride. And of course, Black Lives Matter being a major component. That intersection also of race and LGBTQ issues has created an especially interesting moment to be having these conversations in general, and Black trans lives matter. I'm curious how that has played into Pride celebrations and also just priorities in general for each of you. And Emily, I'd like to start with you in part because you're in New York, and that's where Pride is such a major part of the fabric of New York queer identity. And that was obviously not something that really happened in the traditional way this year. How have you seen just a general shift in the way that this year has how have you seen sort of these issues change?
Yeah, well, I think, yeah, in large part, a lot of it is definitely just like we are not able to congregate in the spaces that we usually congregate. However, I think that there's a huge intersection between that and like within the last few years, a lot of people talking about like actual, Pride parade when that happens. Like we have police officers that are like marching, like we have police officers that are also like marching in uniform. And so I feel like I've seen and heard a conversation about that a lot within the last couple of years, but then obviously with police officers murdering numerous Black folks around this time this year that coincides with Pride Month. I think that people, or I guess I can only speak for myself, but I have no interest in congregating in spaces or providing spaces in which like that can coexist, like in which people like truly don't feel safe. I don't really have any interest in congregating in spaces or providing space for silence, I guess, for people to just kind of not talk about how that's an issue and then go ahead and go to these events, whether that's like physical or virtual, unless like there's actually justice that's being provided for all people. Like if people are going to be put into spaces where they feel like physically unsafe and like their life is physically in danger, then I don't think that we should be providing those spaces. If that's sort of I mean, I think that in large part that's a lot of what I've seen change this year. That's in large part a lot of what I've seen has been different because there is no justice for some if there is no justice for all, so whether that's yeah. I guess,
Yeah, Silvana, how have you seen that dynamic play out in Phoenix?
Oh, Phoenix is messed up. Phoenix is having Phoenix is messed up. We have as we're known for our hate laws like SB 1070 and SB 1062, and they're still pushing for that here, and Pride is just not happening right now, and I'm very okay with that. There's different ways to be proud. What I'm doing right now is an excellent way. I'm very out about who I am because I think it's important, if anything, representation, the next generation to know, and everybody to know that we're not the boogeyman, that our queerness just makes us great. Imagine if queer, like to your general audience, imagine for a minute Think about Broadway, how fabulous it is. Why? Because it was very queer. So imagine if food had been taken over instead of white, straight, hetero, big, tall hat, this is the way it is mentality that took over the kitchen that created what we know cuisine today. Imagine if it was just a bunch of queers just having fun in the kitchen, how delicious and fabulous food would be forever and ever. No, you would never want a straight man in there, would you?
I think I'd be very curious to see that alternate reality. Kristen, I want to also talk, speaking on the topic of kitchens and representation in kitchens. You have been really deliberate about creating a team at Arlo Gray that is really extremely, representative. And we talked a little bit about what that means and how that has benefited the culture of your restaurant. That's something that I think is a major issue in the food industry. And how have you seen that evolve over your career, and how has that informed the way that you run your kitchen and restaurant now?
I during this time I've really thought back to my career, and I used to say, oh well, like I didn't really feel the discrimination. I didn't like did it feel weird to be a woman? I don't know, like all this stuff. And I just never really had a confident, concrete answer, largely in part because I wasn't willing to think about it and really go there myself. And so as I've thought about it over time, is that, I mean, one, I've had the great fortune of working for women in general, and being part of that community, and a woman who is also openly gay was really helpful in that sense. But listen, have I felt it 100%? Have I caught wind of bullshit things that are being said? 1000% back then, and still to this day. I always was living in this space where I was like, who's to say they are treating me this way or being rude to me or unsupportive because I'm a woman, because I'm gay, because I'm an adoptee, because I'm Asian, because I have short hair, because I look different, because all these different things. I don't know. And until you actually ask these people and bring them into the conversation and say, hey, what the hell and where did it come from? I don't know if I'll ever have a true answer. I can guess, but then that's just me projecting my feelings on someone else, which is not okay either. At the end of the day, for me, it was all about, again, being who you are and being it loudly and openly. So therefore, it felt like a safe place for people to come. So it was like, well, how did you get, so many gay people to work at your restaurant? One of our servers coined Arlo gay, and I was like, hell yeah, we are. And it was because, and it's not because I was like, hey, gay people come apply. It was, hey, I am me, I am openly gay. So it was automatically the safer place for people to come. Mm-hmm. It was always at the forefront of my mind to actively reach out and search for women and bring them into the kitchen. Being, again, someone that was brought up in primarily male dominated kitchens. And now the shift has become, it's not like, oh, well, people aren't applying, gay people aren't applying, Black people aren't applying. It's not about that anymore. It's literally about saying, what am I doing as someone that has the power to employ these people? What am I doing wrong? That means like that people aren't coming, that inclusive, like a variety of people aren't coming. And I think instead of the answer for a lot of white men that are being like, well, no Black people are employed, no women are, applying. Okay, well, that's not the problem. The problem is you. And it's about, it's that. So I believe be who you are, and you're going to be loud and proud to be who you are, and you're going to attract that same. Like attracts like. And I think that's something we all need to work much harder at, myself included, of broadening what that looks like.
And how has creating that environment in your restaurant been beneficial, to your workers, to your diners, to the community at large?
I've personally had harder conversations. Like my whole thing with if we're going to spend this much time together, I've age ranges, different colors, different backgrounds, different whatever, different skill levels. And it's the conversations that we have while we're working. It's not about, of course, we have a business to run, we have a restaurant to run, we have consistency that we need to give to our diners who are paying money. But I remember a very, very important conversation I had about Juneteenth with one of my team members, who happens to be a Black woman, and it was it was it caught me off guard, the conversation, because she prompted me and she said, "Hey, do you know what today is?" I was like, we're literally in the middle of service. I'm like racking my brain. I'm like, what's today? What's today? And so it was like I was called out for not understanding. And so I guess not understanding, but not understanding what it meant to her, and how we all need to understand what it means to all of us. And so, and how we can support. So, I think that those are the conversations and the hard conversations that are brought up when you have a variety of different people. You're not talking the same language. You're actually all challenging each other every single day in just our normal interactions that we're forced to have.
Yeah. And, on the subject of representation, Emily, I'm curious. I feel like coffee as an industry has been called out over the years for being especially racist or non-inclusive. How do you feel? Have you seen an evolution in your time in coffee? What do you think needs to sort of change? I know you at East One are very deliberate about trying to create, an inclusive environment. But what's your take on coffee as an industry in general when it comes to racism, LGBTQ issues, et cetera?
Yeah, well, I guess I would also tie that into sort of where I left off before, in that, like, because of this global pandemic, and because of just the general climate of America right now, Pride Month was a lot different because of those things as well. But it's also been a lot different because I think it's given people space that are normally in these aspects of service and the restaurant industry that are extremely whitewashed. I think it's given people space to like be very introspective and also examine, especially like for me, examine like, how do I want to take up space in those places, like to exist while Black and exist while queer, and also exist in a space where I wasn't just like constantly going in and doing 1 million things and just not having enough time to do those things every single day. Like, that's given me a lot of time and space to think about specifically the question that you just asked, in that, like, I would say that coffee has sort of like, with almost everything, there are these two like really different ends of the spectrum. And I have thought a lot about, especially recently, like, what exactly is the gray area that's in between those two ends of the spectrum? Like, I feel like in coffee, especially, we have these like pockets of queerness. Like, we have like these pockets of the industry where they're like extremely queer, or they're extremely populated by like people of color. Obviously, like on the producing end of things, you have loads of people of color, but that's probably not the most openly queer space of this industry. And then on like the total on other, end of the supply chain, I guess, like you have you have roasting, and then you also have specialty. And especially like in specialty, it's very like cis white male dominated. It's extremely cis white male dominated. And I would say, when I sort of began in coffee, especially, specialty, and on the roasting and production end of things, I was living in my own bubble, in that like my boss, my mentor, the person who taught me all of the things that I know, welcomed me into this space because she is also a queer Black woman. So I had this bubble that I was existing in. And then when we started to grow and we started to do things like competition or going to different cuppings, I was like, okay, like, I guess I knew this. I guess I knew that this was how this was going to feel. I guess I knew that this was how this was going to look, but it's so incredibly, incredibly white. And it's so incredibly like, you've got this sort of part in the middle of all of that where there are cafes. And I think that, coffee bars and the staff that like works in the coffee bars do a lot better of a job of talking about frankly, of talking about like race and queerness in a way that isn't as much of like a colonizer mentality that sometimes happens like on the roasting and production end of things.
Mm.
And but then even with regard to that, you've sort of got like the type of cafe that is a community space, and then the type of cafe that is like a serious specialty cafe where like we're all wearing button downs and like, you know, one of the things that I've been trying to examine recently is like how do we find the intersection of both of those sort of types of spaces in coffee? How do we find like the intersection where everybody can feel how I felt, where like unlike any other job that I'd had before, when I just would go and pester my boss about something
Mm.
with the coffee, she would just come up with an answer and just give me literally any amount of detail that I ever wanted. And, you know, like the first coffee job that I had, basically it was telling my boss, oh, there's like something up with like the espresso is running slower, and him being like, okay, let me just like perform this magic on the grinder, and I'm definitely not going to tell you what I just did. And there was so much gatekeeping. It was absolutely insane.
Mm.
And then, you know, now I constantly have flashbacks to other jobs, even outside of the coffee and restaurant industry, where, you know, there was just an absolutely insane amount of gatekeeping. And I've just been trying to like explore and think about how we can create an atmosphere where it really is just like people are asking questions, answer those questions. Like people are qualified for these jobs, like give them those jobs, train them for these jobs. And especially, I would say, almost like the overarching issue to all of that is we're seeing these giant companies in the restaurant industry, and we're seeing these giant companies just all over the place that are saying, oh, like we don't have any queer leadership, or we don't have any Black leadership, so like, oh, we just hired this person, to be the leadership. However, what about everyone underneath them? Because it doesn't really matter if you hire someone that is like a Black person to be whomever in your company if every single person underneath them absolutely wants to see them fail. So
Yeah.
you know, just, you know, exploring how we can just have people that are existing as themselves, that are like generally marginalized people, but absolutely so overqualified for these positions, and how we can just populate those roles with people that deserve to have those roles,
Yeah.
and continue to talk about that, you know, instead of pretending like, you know, we don't see color or whatever it is. So
I add something to that stuff?
Yeah, I was actually just going to throw it to you. I was going to
Okay.
say, please.
Speaking of representation, so when I got hired at James Beard a year ago to run the women's leadership and LGBTQ programs, I felt Claire asked me, what do you think is going to be the biggest challenge for you in doing this? And I was like, people are going to look at me and they're going to be like, of course they got a lesbian and run women's programs. And I had a lot of insecurity about that. And even though I was qualified for it and I ended up being very successful and whatnot, but I let that insecurity of being the person who was the only non-binary lesbian at this prestigious foundation, who was going to be interacting with all these people and supposed to be representing all these people and showing that they were like moving in the right direction. There was a lot of pressure in that. And in that, I did the same thing. I created my own little bubble. So the first people I went to were Ashley Christensen and Kelly Fields. And I went to Deborah Von Treese, and I went to Lucky Michaels. And I went to these women who were queer or trans who made me feel less alone because I was alone. So when you hire someone into your company, you have to keep that in mind too. Nobody wants to be the only one of themselves in a room, whether that's as a speaker, as a panelist, or as an employee. So keeping that first. And then as I got more comfortable, and I honestly started getting called out by my chef bro buddies who were like, yo, what about me, man? Like, we've been working together all this time and I want to learn and I want to help and I want to, you don't have to just go to Ashley Christensen to get the door open for you in the South. Like Kevin Gillespie, you can come to me. Like I can be that person for you, or Greg Baker. Or if you look at the work that Ed Lee does, if you look at the work that a cook named Matt does, when you are interacting with folks at that level who are truly saying, I want to create equity, what they're also saying is, I'm willing to give up my own power. I understand that by introducing you to Spiceology and saying that we need to get more women and more queer women on this brand because we have this Love is Love promotion that just came out, I'm giving up money for myself. I'm giving up opportunity for myself, and I'm opening the door to hand it to somebody else. And I'm not getting credit for it either. I'm just doing it because I believe in equity. You see that with Ed Lee. He gets asked to be, you know, the face of a million different brands. And the first thing he does is say, who is a woman out there that I can give this seat to? Or I won't be on that panel unless there are women on that panel, or I won't be on that panel unless there are queer people on that panel. And those type of things are how we actually make change and how you actually build equity, not just diversity. And I'll tell you, I used to say equality, right? We want equality. I don't want to be equal. I don't want to be equal to the regime that existed before, because that still means that someone's left out. And we see this all the time, right? We see, okay, well, women's issues in 2015 became the biggest thing. So everyone went crazy on women. Everyone's got a women's program. Everybody's putting women forward. And then that sort of like wasn't on trend. So now it was the gay and trans and non-binary communities. So we're going to like borrow the money from women and we're going to give it to the gay community. And then Black Lives Matter happened. Well, that happened 4 years ago, honestly, but it became very public this year, as we all know. And people decided to pay attention to it now, as they should. And they were like, okay, well, now we're going to take the money that we were giving women and we were giving queer people and we're going to give it to the Black community. When you isolate a single issue, you are not creating, you're creating equality for that person at that time, but you're not creating equity within the system. And I think that's the thing we need to be talking about. Equity in the system, which means seats of power, money, influence, and attention will be taken away from the people who previously had the majority share of it. But that will just leave the best of the majority share. You'll have a lot less mediocrity in that majority share because you'll start to see all these other marginalized folks and all the other people that represent the broader community mixing it in. And you'll end up with the best of the best in each category, as opposed to a lot of mediocre, some really, really good, and then the fucking ballers of these marginalized communities, right? And then they're alone. And so that's the conversation I think we need to be having as we're moving forward with what does DEI mean and how do we create equity?
And DEI, just for the layman.
Diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yes,
and that,
immigrant.
yeah, and I think, you know, one of the things that is always the most encouraging at Life and Time for us is that we, you know, as a publication, we've always been more interested, I'm speaking for you also, Antonio, but I think we've always been more interested in human stories than necessarily the food on the plate. And we have been able to, fortunately, tap into all of these conversations through food. What role, and I'm going to open this up to all of you because you're coming from different parts of the industry, how can we use food to be active as a tool for engagement, for community, for activism? How have you seen it used? How do you think it can be used going forward? And obviously now that we're in this COVID and, you know, mid-COVID and potentially, you know, soon to be post-COVID, hopefully, you know, what does that look like? How can we use our platforms, our resources to push for change? Silvana,
Yeah, I what I find is that the louder my voice, right? Early on, I had a customer whisper in my ear, a woman, and she said, "Remember, chef, with success comes great responsibility." And so I've taken it serious, you know, and for me, during COVID, I had nothing else to do but start giving food away. And, you know, I couldn't fathom a closed kitchen that could possibly be open and feeding people. So I went from a non-essential to essential. And as I do that, I remind people that I am Mexican. I remind people that I am queer. I remind people that I'm the little guy, that I don't have, I don't know, Cheesecake Factory money, right? I remind people that. And then I get the attention because I just speak out. And that's my activism, to always be speaking out on all issues, not just my issue, your issues too. Everybody has something. I could start right now and make a list and it would just get long, wouldn't it? Right? But for this subject, I am as queer as I can be and I own it. That's it. And I make spectacular food.
I think you make a really good point too, Chef, on the fact that the base of it was food access, right? I came from the food access space before I was at Beard, and I work with Hungry Harvest. And what we found in Baltimore is when you feed people, the rate of crime goes down, the rate of happiness goes up. Folks that can have food and understand just their basic needs being met can go on and worry about bigger issues. And so that's the place that food has. It's not necessarily, who's going to win the James Beard Award this year, who's going to get the Michelin star, who's going to win like any number of competitions or whatever it is. It's truly about us using our talents to feed people at the most basic level. And you see the Lee Initiative did such an incredible job with that, with the restaurant relief program. And there's folks like Silvana out here who are and Isaac Tupes down in New Orleans, who just without questions and without any money being handed to them, were like, all right, let's see what's in the freezer. We're feeding people today. We are feeding people today. And that is what it means to be hospitality. And that's how food will, I think, be celebrated after this. It won't be in accolades and white tablecloths. It'll be in just truly offering a meal, offering that relief to somebody.
Yeah, Kristen, you kind of touched on that when we discussed how Arlo Gray will look like going forward. What are your thoughts on that?
The second it happened, and over the course of 3.5, 4 months now, my thought and my opinion has changed drastically every single day, every minute. And it's like, to do X, Y, and Z, you're also, putting X, Y, and Z at risk. To do one thing else is going to suffer. And it's just this ongoing battle. It's like, you want to put your team back together and you want to feed people and you want to give them their jobs, but then you're like, hold on. Okay, first of all, my restaurant's in Texas. Shit's happening there on many different levels. And is it irresponsible for me to open? I believe so, yes. Does it kill me every day that my team doesn't have their jobs? 1,000,000 times, yes. And so it's just this ongoing battle of never feeling like you have the answer and never feeling like I stall out myself on a daily basis because I'm like, I run myself smack dab into a wall. I'm like, okay, so what's the answer, Kish? Like, do you have one? And I will say though, the one thing that's been really great is that because the whole idea of queer food and queer community was a very foreign concept to me. It became a larger thing for me in my life when Arlo Gray happened and when our kitchen happened and our family came together, and what it actually means. I am 1,000% a student in all of this still. I didn't know what queer food meant until James Beard, Alana, and Sabrina, amazing women. We're like, hey, you want to come cook for our queer underground supper club? I was like, the what? I was like, what is this? And for me, I've never been one to go to gay bars. I've never it's not me. One, I don't want to go to a bar, period, ever anymore. I'm too old for that shit right now. And I'm tired. So I don't want to congregate around alcohol. But this idea of this supper club, and I was introduced to so many different people from all walks of life, from every single area, every part of the industry. And it was the most educating form of schooling for me. And I think now kind of looking back at Arlo Gray and what we have and all the things that you recognize now that you had and what were so important because they're no longer present every day with us anymore, is that the ability to have these conversations even after the fact of what it means to be who you are in the context of our kitchen. These conversations have now opened themselves up, which is really important. And again, I'm the student in all of it, and I'm listening to what they have to say, and I'm trying to figure out what it is that makes us better when we return in some form, and what it means to give back first and foremost to one another, and then how we can spread that message to other people and give it back to our guests. So that's a hard question. I don't have an answer for so many of it because so much is unknown.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and what I'm hearing a lot of in this conversation and in previous conversations is um, we're facing a lot of challenges right now as humans. Forget the individual populations, but the hopeful elements that I keep hearing are about next generation, future generation, leadership, mentorship. How can we arm sort of the upcoming wave of people who are going to be formative in this business? Um, I want to talk just briefly about the importance of fostering that next generation in all of these different areas, and especially because LGBTQ youth are especially at risk. Um, and we are a community that is already has a history of being isolated. I think that compounded with certainly what we're going through as a world right now, and the lack of healthcare access in this industry. Um, how do we provide a nurturing environment for LGBTQ youth to enter this business, to be able to make those strides and changes and form, the future of the food and beverage industry? And I'll open that up to anybody that's interested in talking about it.
Well, it's a interesting question because what's within our power? Our kitchens are a safe place for us. We run them. We're in charge. We speak whatever language we want. It's our home, away from the place we sleep, actually. But the community at large, for me, it's being the best example I can. And I know I swim against the current. I know that. I've been doing it for years. And but my strokes are big, and they're bigger than the other guys, and I make sure and it's just my mentality. I have that phoenix mentality. I burn and I ascend even greater. And I've done it over I'm very resilient that way. So I try to lead because I know that there's a lot of people, I'm an ex-Jehovah's Witness, not me personally, my parents, but I was brought up that way. So with that comes a lot of isolation and having to figure things out. And I remain fluid. I always have, and that's the key to my success. What you think of me is none of my business. But not everybody is like me, and that's where I need to be there for any generation to be an example, because that eternal hurt, that isolation, to be lonely like that, to be thinking that you are queer, but in the odd way, not in the celebrated way, not in the empowered way. Remember that, folks. Your queerness is your superpower. People wish they were queer. They're all vanilla.
They're certainly very interested in it, right? And I think what Chef is saying makes total sense. And one side of it, it's just being yourself and showing the world that there is a successful person who is queer, who deserves love, who has found success. Because all growing up, I mean, all I had was Ellen and Rosie O'Donnell, and I was like, I don't know, I guess I'll go to school for theater and be a talk show host. That seems to be the only opportunity there is, right? And so having those examples of folks to say like, okay, you can look at me or anyone on this panel and be like, okay, I can be successful, I can find love. It's not just about my sexuality and who I'm sleeping with or the bad stories that you hear. It's all about just like living your best life and finding your happiness. And I also think it's about knowing where your ability ends, right? Like I'm very good at like speaking or like being visible to people. I'm very good at like helping my friends' kids figure out if they want to get their hair cut or not, or if they want to come out or not. Like I can do all of those sort of very empathetic, touchy-feely things. But there are people who do other parts of it better. And I think it's about educating yourself on them. The Okra Project is feeding Black trans folks, like, period. Meeting that basic need allows them to thrive. And so give your money to the Okra Project. There's an organization based in California with Michaela Mendelson called Trans Can Work. And it essentially teaches LGBTQ youth how to work in the hospitality industry, because you're going to be dealing with a lot of customer comments. You're going to be dealing with a little bit of insecurity if you have to wear a uniform. And then you also want to just know like, okay, we're going to train you in this sort of cohort of your colleagues, so that you're not embarrassed about who you are as a person or feeling like the only one and trying to learn knife skills and trying to learn the register. So looking at those two organizations and knowing if it's not you, no one expects every chef or every restaurant owner on here to be like that light, but find the people who are doing the work well and bring them in as partners and pay them.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we could certainly, there's so many conversations to continue having on this subject, but I know we're running close on time. So Antonio, do we have a couple of audience questions for the group before we wrap up?
Yeah, totally. So let's see here. There's a few questions that people submitted when they RSVPs. We've picked a couple that we just want to ask here. Cheyenne asks, how do you navigate dealing with vendors that are not LGBTQIA plus friendly, but they have the best cost for the product? Oof.
I personally, obviously dealing with vendors often, I personally have never had that interaction of negativity. Consider me lucky, consider me privileged for it, consider me whatever, for whatever reason, it just has never really crossed my path. But if it were to cross my path, like, you don't place a deal on like the proper actual matter at hand that is important. So it's kind of like, no thanks, move along, goodbye, and I'll take my business elsewhere. Is really ultimately the most power you have in that moment, is just to not give them your money. Period.
Yeah, purchasing power, being one of the most important powers that we have as consumers in the society, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So let's see. We got a couple more here. This is just for anybody in the group. Hoi Ning asks, how does race/ethnicity intersect with the LGBTQ identity in this critical work?
Well, I can speak for the my community, and we have our own bars. The Spanish community, and same thing for the trans community, and it does. I think that the same thing that applies to us in the culinary world applies within race. Does become something very important. Like, oh, are you going to the gay bar? Right. So right there, you're identifying it. Are you going to the lesbian bar? Is it the country bar around here? It's country bar. Is it it's the Spanish bar, the Mexican bar? We're going to dance cumbia. Oh, it's trans night, or what is it? Race does divide us as a community. It really does. Hate to say it, but we have to acknowledge it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's
Emily.
Because sorry.
I'm sorry. I looked like Emily might have been talking, but
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was muted.
Go ahead.
I mean, I would just also add to that, I guess, that just remembering that everything is really intersectional. Remembering that, especially like in coffee or in specialty coffee, there's a lot of like saviorism. I mean, like specifically like white saviorism, and just remembering that, I mean, it's like people don't necessarily always think of like everything as intersectional, or you hear the phrase of, don't make everything about race, or don't make everything about X or whatever, when it's like people that are also in the queer community have also been kind of some of the most racist people in the industry to me, personally. So just remembering that, it doesn't stop at like, the beginning of the supply chain when we're thinking about race. Like, we have to deconstruct these issues within our own community. So.
Absolutely. And Kristen.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I've been trying to learn a lot more about, is because here I look one way, I was brought up in a white household. I kind of identify with my Korean heritage, but I kind of don't know a jack shit about it. So I don't really understand what that is. And figuring out what my line and what the definition for me of race and everything else colliding with it. Cause I'm like, from what I'm learning, the Asian community is from again what I'm hearing and what I'm learning about is a relatively quiet group of people, right? Like, just say what you want to say, but like, you kind of ride somewhere in the middle where where you feel oftentimes your voice probably isn't heard on either side, and trying to understand what that looks like and how to navigate that now as me looking the way I do, but not really fully understanding what it means and what the responsibility there is. It's confusing.
Can I just, Emily, can I just follow up on something you just said just a little bit ago on how the queer community has also been racist in your experience. How has that intersected with the protests, Black Lives Matter, and we just wrapped up Pride Month as well? How has all that just kind of converged into one sort of movement, or has it been converged into one movement? Has one area been slightly silenced than the other because now on everybody's top of mind is Black Lives Matter? How, like, what have you sort of experienced or seen especially in the last month with these two movements kind of coming together? And on top of that, you can't really, with the pandemic, you can't really gather in these places either, but you do have almost like permission to go and protest for Black Lives Matter. But how have you seen like both movements kind of converging?
I feel like I've seen, like, frankly, I think one of the most heartbreaking things about 2020 Black Lives Matter movement is that social media is such a huge part of what we do in every facet of our lives now. And I have seen like some of the most performative things done by some of the most, frankly, outwardly racist people that I know in the industry. I've seen so many performative things, and it's kind of like, I actually don't really care if you were at this march, if you are not going to demonstrate with your actions in the future that you have deconstructed pretty much like all of your privilege, whether that's like whiteness or like cis privilege or what have you. I think that I talk a lot about intersectionality, I guess. And, again, it's important to remember that all of these things are intersectional. And when you are, working alongside people every single day, day in and day out, you need to just deconstruct things that you've done in the past. So if that's an interaction that someone, especially like a Black person, a Black queer person has called you out for, or an experience that you had with that person that was maybe uncomfortable, or an experience where, even I would say, especially with Black folks that are often labeled as more aggressive, if you've had an experience with those people where you've thought like, that person's really going for it and that makes me uncomfortable, like deconstructing why you feel uncomfortable around like those Black and brown people, and especially Black people, deconstructing those experiences is really, really important as far as how we move forward interpersonally when we do get back to going into work every day, preparing food, preparing coffee, roasting coffee, doing production. When we get back into that world, I think it's really important that we've already done the work to begin deconstructing our actions so that we can actually move forward and not just have this be sort of like the, Black Lives Matter 4 years ago, where we stopped talking about it for a really long time until we felt that the conditions were right for us to start caring about Black people again.
Yeah, I think, that term intersectionality is really the most important, sort of takeaway. I think, just as human beings, there isn't a one or another. There's all this, it's nuance. It's how all of those things play into one another and react together. That I think we need to be especially aware of, and keeping that momentum. And I think that is something that a lot of food businesses have been questioning as well. Is we can make a donation today, we can do this thing today, but how do we live it every day going forward, for whatever community, for whatever that looks like. And I think that's going to be a very interesting part of what post COVID, post all of this, post 2020, what our next sort of chapter looks like, just as human beings. Antonio, what do you have on deck? Or
We got one more here. So this is from Jenny. She says, I recently listened to a conversation, What is Queer Food, held by the New York Times. As the ages of the panelists was somewhat older, I was surprised that nobody mentioned community and communal dining, which has been central to my queer identity. My question is, does communal cooking and eating resonate to you as politically queer?
Yes. Yes, big time. And if you follow a Pride table, they did an incredible series last year. They weren't able to do it this year, of course, because of the virus, but where they were bringing together people of all different ages, all different backgrounds, talking about how queer people feed people. And a lot of the recipes were focused around the fact that oftentimes the LGBTQ community is broke. They're either working multiple jobs, or they haven't been able to establish like a core family situation. So this community thing that you drive when you have family meal, or you drive when you're making, crazy things. Like one of the dishes that I had at Pride Table last year was cinnamon chicken wings. And it was awesome. And it was made by this woman who told a story, who was like, I wanted to feed my neighbors because I knew they were struggling and I didn't have any hot sauce. And so I thought, well, cinnamon's kind of hot. And she developed this whole new recipe around essentially using stuff that's in your pantry and getting together. I think, the ethos of the James Beard house originally was because Beard was a queer man and he wasn't fully out, and he was much more comfortable having these crazy parties at his house, and like everybody getting together and being able to be yourself. And obviously over the last 30 years that has changed quite a bit, but at that ethos, it's been forever. Speakeasies, house parties, it's because you can really be your authentic self without having to worry, are you going to get fired? Are you going to be too gay? Are you not going to be gay enough? Like, or to Kristen's point earlier, I'm too old to go to the bars. I don't have an eyebrow slit. Like, I'm not sure that I fit in with the kids anymore. And so, how do you gather, and how do you be yourself and share your culture and share your truth without judgment? And oftentimes that does come from communal dining. Also comes from not having the money to go out to restaurants a lot too.
yeah.
It also,
Yeah, and I think
I'm sorry. It also comes from being isolated, alienated by your family. So you have to make a family, and that is what makes us extra special chefs.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something that I think has been on my mind a lot lately, also, especially with COVID, is we were already losing a lot of designated queer spaces. And now we're seeing, I read the other day, there are 16 lesbian bars left in the United States, the entire United States, 16. So, and they're on life support right now because of COVID. So I'm curious if, anyone has any thoughts on that, the future of what that looks like. Is this maybe a moment to sort of resurrect that idea? Is this an opportunity to maybe be considering opening something like that? And Emily, also to the point of coffee and sort of Kristen's point, like, not everybody wants it to be a bar either. Cafes and have been sort of a sober or daytime gathering space for the LGBT community as well. What are the group's thoughts on that?
I, one thing that I would say, especially with cafes, is that something that's happened, especially within the last few years, is that touching on the point of, oftentimes like the queer community will, not have a lot of money, or, you need to really find your own community within these spaces. Um, Something that makes me sort of sad about coffee is walking into cafes oftentimes, and customers will say this as well, like it looks like an Apple store in here. Everyone is in the cafe individually staring at their laptops, and they're there for hours. And one of the things that I've thought a lot about recently, when we're getting back into, non-COVID times and people are gathering in cafes again, is that right now we have an opportunity to sort of switch those, the coffee shop or the cafe is thought of as like a community space. And I question a lot, within the last few years, like, is it really that to us anymore? Because I almost think that it becomes more of a co-working space, or, when you're going around grabbing customers' dishes, they almost seem to be upset at you for distracting them. And, kind of like, can we make those community spaces again? Can we make those spaces where people feel like they can just sit and feel safe and feel good and have a conversation, or maybe talk to the person next to them, which is so absolutely Midwestern of me. But I mean, it is the same really when I go back home to Madison, Wisconsin. Like it really sort of is the same, where I remember being able to walk into cafes and people were sort of like chatting and, enjoying the company of other people. And it's not so much that way anymore. And so, I guess I have the question, and I'm curious of how we can sort of use this point as a pivot to create those spaces again for people, and not have it be so divided between these places that are very deliberately community cafes, and they have signs up that say you can't use your laptop at all because that's exactly what it is and what it's going to say. And how we can pivot these other spaces where they become almost co-working spaces to something in between, like how we can find the point that's in between.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, that's something that's going to come down so much to hopefully a refocus on small business. And to that point, I actually kind of want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, Emily, also, is the idea of that performative aspect that you brought up. In big business, we're seeing a lot of brands kind of jumping on the LGBTQ bandwagon, so to speak. And I know this is kind of a hot button topic. There's been a lot of debate over the last few years. Is that genuine? I mean, you walk around in June in Brooklyn, where I was living near Emily's coffee shop, and it was like every bank and every fast food place and every major corporation has a rainbow flag, and then July 1st comes and all that's completely gone again. So what is that? What is the take on that, and that sort of idea of this performative support aspect? And is there an argument to be made? Does anyone have thoughts on that?
Growing up seeing nothing, as you and I grew up together, and we were only an hour outside the city, and like that was the escape. I think if I were a gay kid who didn't have a community yet, maybe was living in the Midwest, or at Connecticut's bad enough a lot of the time, like, even if it's just a relief for that 1 month to see yourself out there. Do I think it helps sales? No. Do I think it's performative? Absolutely. But to the people who can't be themselves, they have just that one little moment in their head when their mom's taking them to buy a backpack at Target or whatever, and they see it everywhere, and they, that you have a future. I think gay kids, the LGBTQ kids, oftentimes you don't see yourself as an old person because you just can't imagine that you make it that long. Like you can't imagine before you're out or when you're struggling that you'll be able to endure this for as long as you possibly can. And I think when you started seeing all of this, is now you see, like, I had a Girl Scout troop come through right before COVID to the house, and we were showing them around, and all of them were like, I'm a lesbian, I'm pansexual, I'm gay, I'm trans, and this is Skylar, and she just got her new pronouns. And I was like, fuck yes. If like corporate America did that by making the kids think that there's a place for them in any way, I'm like, cool, throw your rainbows on my bottle of shampoo and my razors and every other stupid thing. It doesn't make me buy it necessarily, but for those people who never saw it anywhere, like,
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think we are about out of time. Unfortunately, I would love to talk to all of you all day, and we're so grateful that you took the time to be with us. And I feel like we've learned a lot here for sure. So I just want to wrap up. Does anybody maybe just with a quick word from each of you to sort of a next generation? What would you say to anyone who's in this position and wants to be in this business? Silvana, do you want to start?
Yeah, do it. Own it. Own what's yours. Listen, my skin, my heritage gives me a history. You know, whatever the trauma was, it's generational. Whatever the success was, it's generational. It's cellular. It's me. But my queerness, that's a solo ride. I can't look back and say, oh yeah, because Uncle Tom was a really good queer and this and this and that, right? So we have to be what we have to be now for the next generation, so they can say, hey, yeah, my Auntie Coco, she was badass queer, man. Be it.
Absolutely. V?
So I would say to them, I think Silvana said it best, own it. If you want to get into this industry, own your own business. I used to think that the validation I would get from being with Danny Meyer or being with Steve Hansen or being with this one or that one or being with Beard even was going to be what made it okay for me to be in this business. And I needed that validation. And what I'm saying is, like, if you don't own it, if you don't own your business, you don't really get the full effect of it. You don't need anyone else to validate you. You don't need anyone else for you to make them famous with your creativity or with your work. Like, be your own and truly own it.
Absolutely. Emily?
I would echo those sentiments as well. I would say, I mean, let's continue to deconstruct past actions, deconstruct what we're doing currently and in the future, and also just demonstrate, practice what you're preaching. I mean, demonstrate all of these things with your actions. Similarly, I am also an adoptee, and my parents are cis, they're straight, they're white, and they are some of the most supportive people that I know. And the only way that I know that is because they are constantly demonstrating that with what they are doing and what they are not doing. They're demonstrating it with their actions. So
amazing. And Kristen?
I think something that I would say, and it's something that I wish someone would have told me earlier on when I was a kid, is to choose the unpopular decision and choose the thing that makes it feel a little bit like, you get like that pit in your stomach. You're like, shit, am I saying the wrong thing? Am I doing the wrong thing? Oh my God, like, what are people going to think? And it's about completely switching that and choosing that unpopular decision and choosing the thing that is often not said, in order to create the conversation and create a space where like-minded people can come and thrive as well.
Thank you all so much. This has been really just an amazing opportunity to have this group all sitting at the same table, so to speak. And we're really grateful for your time. We're grateful for everyone that tuned in today, and continues to support Life and Thyme and our leaders and our businesses and our small businesses and this industry. We thank you.
Thank you, everybody. And if you want to continue to support Life and Thyme, we're 100% independent. We're ad-free. I mean, we're the outliers here, and we want to continue doing these webinars ongoing. They're completely free. But if you want to support us, we have a membership program. You could just go to lifeandthyme.com and sign up. It's mad cheap. I mean, it's just a few dollars every month, and you'll be supporting independent journalism and having us also continue these wonderful educational webinars. And thank you so much to all of our panelists that spent the last hour with us. We're very, very grateful for your time and your insight. And yeah, thank you so much, everybody. This webinar will also be available later on to be viewed on our website. So just stay tuned on our socials. But stay safe and take care. Bye bye.